Welcome to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski. Thank you for tuning in. Normally, we're on location, or we invite an expert, analyst, or involved participant from the Middle East, someone who's independent, honest, straightforward, outspoken. And we've had many such people on this program, and as far as location, we've already been able to bring you programs from Jericho, from Jerusalem, from Cairo, from Israel, and from various conferences that have taken place here in Washington, D.C., where I live and where we produce this program. But last week and this week, we're doing something a little different. We're discussing the Mideast peace process, ? And we're doing so by a select number of quotes that we've taken from journals, from speeches, from articles, from major personalities who have spoken up about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And these quotes are not what you'd expect. If you watch TV, if you watch ceremonies, if you listen to presidents and prime ministers and Chairman Yasser Arafat, you'd think that the peace process is well supported, creating great amounts of optimism and hope, and that peace had finally dawned between Israel and the Palestinians. Sadly, that is not the case. If you listen to what the experts have to say, especially the honest, independent experts who aren't speaking because they're being paid to do so, or because they're lobbyists, or because they're public relations hacks, or and this is true on both the Jewish and the Arab side these days. If you listen to what the experts have to say, if you go over there, if you visit, if you talk with people honestly, openly, you find a tremendous amount of apprehension, gloom, despair, anxiety. Last week, for instance, in quoting from Professor Edward Said from a magnificent, a brilliant cover article called The Mirage of Peace, a cover article in The Nation magazine, in fact, Edward Said warned that he not only thought things were getting much worse for the Palestinians, but in the long term, the so-called peace process would also be detrimental to the Israelis. He said it was crucial to bear witness to the truth as opposed to the hype and the lies and the distortions. And in fact, he pretty much likened Yasser Arafat to a collaborator, as did another of the persons we quoted from, Professor Israel Shahak at Hebrew University, an Israeli in Jerusalem, a Holocaust survivor and a longtime champion of Palestinian rights. We also talked about Professor Noam Chomsky, who not only has said that the peace agreements and what we've all been witnessing these past few years is nothing but a continuation of long-time Israeli rejectionist policies, rejecting Palestinian national rights, rejecting Palestinian claims to equality and democracy, but he likened what is happening now to the institution, not the end, of a system of apartheid between Israelis and Palestinians. And for those of us who have been there, who have seen the checkpoints, who have seen the barbed wire surrounding Gaza, who have seen the Palestinian cities surrounded by various checkpoints which only Palestinians who have the right pass, the right piece of paper, the right permit, are allowed to leave or move from one place to another, with blue license plates for Palestinians and yellow license plates for Israelis. The analogy between apartheid as it was implemented, whites to blacks in South Africa, and what's now taking place in the Middle East between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, it's an analogy that bears a lot of resemblance, unfortunately. And last week, we also talked about Professor Abdul Sitar Qasim, Political Science Department, Nablus, one of the major cities in the West Bank, and he discussed that the self-autonomy was not serving Palestinian interests or Palestinian rights, but was serving Israeli interests. And he compared the Palestinian Authority to General Anton Lahad, the head of the puppet South Lebanese army in southern Lebanon, who the Israelis supply and manipulate. And by analogy, he suggested that's exactly what's happening to Yasser Arafat and the PA. A word about the PA and the PNA, by the way. The Israelis refuse to call Yasser Arafat president, and they refuse to call the authority that has been set up the Palestinian National Authority. They call it the Palestinian Authority, and they call Arafat chairman. They've in fact returned letters to him that have been sent calling him president. The Palestinians, needing credibility among their own people and wanting to pretend that in fact they've gotten more than they have, they are the ones who use PNA, Palestinian National Authority, and they're the ones who call Yasser Arafat president rather than just chairman. The semantics are not unimportant. Where this whole process is leading in the end, nobody knows for sure, but the Israelis have a pretty good handle on it. And more than likely, the thinking is that the Palestinian community will fragment into cantons, that they will be kept separated and divided, and the long-term Israeli strategy of dividing the area between the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, at least in terms of control and economy, and the Zionist Jewish State of Israel is probably what the Labor Party is moving toward. All right. So much for what we were talking about last week. There are a number of other very important and telling quotes that I want to share with you this week. Tom Segev, Israel's New York Times, Haaretz newspaper. Very simple, very straightforward quote. The Palestinian Authority has become, quote, a brutal tyranny. Well, you don't hear that here in the United States. In Israel, it's discussed fairly openly. Tom Segev is a well-known Israeli writer. Haaretz is the equivalent of the New York Times newspaper. You don't hear it from Palestinians because Palestinians like Professor Qassam, if they speak up, are quite literally shot. Professor Qassam was accosted by 3 or 4 members of the PA, the secret police. He was shot 4 times. He did survive, but it was not only an assassination attempt, which in this case did not succeed, it was an intimidation attempt, telling everybody else, watch your back. You speak up against Yasser Arafat, you speak up against what's going on, and this could happen to you too. I want to share with you another quote from Professor Said. This one from a lecture he delivered at Tufts University. But before that, we'll come right back to that. Before that, let's go to this week's quote of the week. This week's quote of the week is from Professor Moshe Zimmerman, teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's Israeli. He's a Holocaust survivor. Here's what he has to say, quote, "There is an entire sector in the Jewish public which I unhesitatingly define as a copy of the German Nazis. Look at the children of the Jewish Hebron settlers. They are exactly like the Hitler Youth. From infancy, they are pumped with ideas that all Arabs are bad, of how every Gentile is against us. They are turned into paranoids. They think of themselves as a master race. They are exactly like the Hitler Youth. There is a very dangerous tendency of leniency towards this sector. I am reminded of those conservatives in Germany who collaborated with Hitler out of exactly the same reasons and who made the same mistakes as we do now." Welcome back to Mideast Realities. I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host, and as you know, we're talking about the realities of the Mideast Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Not the hype, not the ceremonies, not the glitter, not the hoopla, and not the presentation of the lobbyists and the governments and the public relations firms and the politicians, but the actual realities on the ground that independent experts, writers, analysts have been talking freely and openly about, but who most people are not able to hear because the mass media doesn't carry these people, doesn't quote these people, doesn't discuss the peace process in these honest, forthright terms. And before the break for our quote of the week, I mentioned that I'd be sharing with you another quote from Professor Edward Said from a lecture he gave earlier this year at Tufts University. And by the way, Professor Said is one of the most articulate, one of the most outspoken, one of the most committed analysts of the Middle East, of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. He was born there, left as a boy, grew up in Cairo, came to the United States, distinguished himself by becoming a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University. Anyone who knows him knows of his integrity, honesty, decency, commitment. And just listen to what he has to say about Yasser Arafat, about the peace process. Quote, "I don't think it's wrong or any kind of exaggeration to say that Arafat and his Palestine Authority have become collaborators with the military occupation, a sort of Vichy government for Palestinians." I'll come back to Vichy government in a minute. Continuing Edward Said's quote, "With Oslo, the peace process entered a new and much more destructive phase. Far from bringing peace, it brought greater suffering for Palestinians, the main victims of this mess, and a much greater threat to the long-term interests of the Israeli people. Every leader involved with the Oslo process, Palestinian, Israeli, American, or European, has acted, in my opinion, without principles and without anything remotely resembling vision and truthfulness. Worse, large droves of intellectuals, scholars, and experts have, in my opinion, betrayed their vocations, to say nothing of their expertise and knowledge. And this betrayal has contributed to the amazingly compliant attitude of the American media in particular, who have celebrated, extolled, saluted, and rejoiced when there has been neither occasion nor cause to justify such excessive hand-clapping and jubilation." Well, a few paragraphs, but my God, look what's being said here. First of all, he's saying of the leader of the former leader of the Palestinians, since the PLO doesn't really exist anymore and there is a collaborationist government, and here's Edward Said saying it. It's a collaborationist regime. One can analyze how we got there, why the decisions were taken, why Arafat took the steps he took. But at the end of the day, this is how the situation is discussed by many of the leading experts around the world. Now, Vichy government. There may be many people watching this program too young to remember, but the Germans in World War II invaded France. They went around the Maginot Line. They essentially took over France. De Gaulle and others fled. The Nazis set up a puppet government. It was called the Vichy government because its seat of government was in Vichy, France. The head of that government was a marshal in the German army, Marshal Pétain. And, well, we all know what happened in terms of history, and we all know that that government was considered a collaborationist with the German occupation. So to call a regime a Vichy government for Palestinians is to make a very potent and hard-hitting point. The other extremely interesting part of Edward Said's quote is his comment about intellectuals and scholars and experts who have betrayed their vocations, not to mention their knowledge and expertise. Well, the sad reality of the situation is that people tend to conform to the institutions around them, to the power around them. People also tend at times to be lemmings, to jump on the same bandwagon. And it has been sad to see the way the press has, the mainstream press has rallied around agreements without any serious analysis, without any detailed explanation. I remember myself during the Rabin Arafat signing ceremony on the White House lawn, I was asked by Canadian national television to be on for the few hours of the ceremony and to occasionally comment with my own opinions about what I thought was taking place. I wasn't asked by American media, nor was Edward Said, nor was Noam Chomsky. And one of the first things I pointed out, which I was told had not been pointed out to American viewers of American network television, is that the very head of the Palestinian negotiating team, the very man who headed the team in Madrid, Spain, the very man who read the Palestinian position, the very man who for years had headed up the Palestinian negotiating team, was so upset by the agreement that Arafat had signed that he refused to even come to the White House ceremony. Now, that was a very telling and important commentary, I thought, but American viewers didn't hear it. In this case, I was on Canadian national television. Well, we'll come back to this discussion of the realities of the Mideast peace process, the realities of the Israeli-Palestinian imbroglio, predicament. But as we try to do each week now, let's break at this point for the Mideast realities lie of the week. This week's lie of the week is really, in a sense, a laugh of the week. Maybe we should always have a laugh of the week as well, especially when we're dealing with such serious topics as peace processes and what they are and what they aren't. Let me just share with you how the Washington Post reported in its back pages the recent Arafat Rabin White House ceremony. Quote, White House Chief of Staff Leon Panetta didn't even try to disguise it, his eyelids drooping, his mouth opening in a huge yawn. Secretary of State Warren Christopher, a known expert, did a full half-gainer forward from his seat before snapping back up into a smart recovery. Palestinian official Mahmoud Abbas just rested his chin on his chest, and that was that, while Secretary Robert Rubin tried to fight it with small, startling head bobs. Call it appease in our times. Indeed, the scene in the glittery White House East Room yesterday was very peaceful toward the end of a long ceremony marking the latest Israeli-Palestinian agreement. Official after official fought to stay awake in what one called this, quote, event bordering on the historic, unquote. An impressive number of eyelids slowly closed, and heads of many of the 200 notables nodded and swayed. Welcome back to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski, and last week and this, we've been trying to look at the realities of the Mideast peace process, Israeli-Palestinian peace process. We've been doing that not by going on location, which we've done before. We've been in Jericho and Jerusalem and Israel and Cairo this year, and not by inviting one expert into the studio for a talk, discussion, but rather by compiling a series of the most interesting and most articulate and most knowledgeable and straightforward quotes from leading experts in the Middle East and here in the United States about what's really taking place. And I've been sharing those quotes with you and trying to analyze them a bit in the hopes that that would help you understand what the peace process really is all about, as opposed to the hype and presentations from the politicians and the lobbyists and the interest groups, which are often designed not to help you understand what the peace process is all about, but in fact just the opposite, to twist and distort people's thinking, to provide a smokescreen that actually camouflages what is really happening under the guise of the seductive term peace process, which Edward Said has called a murdering, a wanton murdering of language, to use that term to describe what's taking place. But it's not just intellectuals and experts and independent personalities who have been speaking up, not just the Edward Saids and Noam Chomskys and Tom Segevs, but also people at the very heart of the American political establishment. Let me give you a very good illustration of that. Each year in Washington, the Middle East Institute holds its annual conference. Middle East Institute is a very laid-back organization, usually headed by a former ambassador. It's sort of a society of Middle East Arabists and people who have served in the region. Very rarely causes any controversy, very rarely reflects anything other than sort of mainstream views about what's taking place, corporate views. The organization gets a tremendous amount of backing and sponsorship from corporations and oil companies. Even so, listen to what the keynote speaker said at the conference earlier this year, just a few weeks ago in fact. Keynote speaker, none other than Professor William Quandt, now at the University of Virginia, but formerly of the National Security Council, and who has worked in government for years, and thus is pretty much a team player. Here's what he said. My early assessment, this is his quote, "My early assessment makes me pessimistic about the next stage of negotiations. It is not so much a matter of figuring out whether the proverbial glass is half empty or half full. It is more the growing conviction that this may well be the last negotiated agreement between Israelis and Palestinians for many years to come. Instead of building momentum for peace and inspiring mutual trust and confidence, this agreement could portend a long, dry, and possibly quite violent period ahead. Instead of living in peace alongside a viable Palestinian democratic state, it looks increasingly as if Israel will remain in control of much of the West Bank and Gaza." Well, my own interpretation of what's being said here is that Bill Quandt is suggesting, and pretty outspokenly in this case, that the agreements that have been made have really fudged over the real issues. They've patched together a series of terms and understandings and agreements that are sold to the public as a peace process, but in reality it's a peace process that doesn't look like it really has anywhere to go, that isn't going to end up being a peace that's widely accepted. It's not going to be justice. It's not going to be stable. That it's hard to see how even what has been discussed to this point is going to be implemented, not to mention the fact that all the hard issues, all the gut key issues, have really been left for the future totally undecided. Among those issues, Palestinian statehood or Palestinian reservations, Palestinian democracy or client regime imposed by Israel and the West and paid for by the United States, the Europeans, and the Japanese. Settlements, looks like the settlements are going to stay. The Israelis are spending millions and millions of dollars to build roads from pre-1967 Israel into the occupied territories that bypass Palestinian towns, villages, and essentially leave the Palestinians in pockets on reservations with Israeli checkpoints and roadblocks leaving all the cities. The settlers maintain their settlements, they maintain control of the territory, the resources, the water, the land. Not to mention Jerusalem, where of course the Israelis have said repeatedly over and over and over again that they're not going to make any compromise about Jerusalem, and the Palestinians are just going to have to accept that. Which brings us to the last quote I want to share with you about what's going on. From Cairo, from Esmat Abdul-Magid, who's Secretary General of the Arab League. Here's what he has to say about Jerusalem. Quote, "Israel wants to give an historic and religious legitimacy to its aims on Jerusalem, which is the biggest act of falsification in history. These celebrations," and he's referring to the Israeli Jerusalem 3000 celebrations, "these celebrations with their length and scale are also a violation of the spirit and the letter of the Israeli-Palestinian Declaration of Principles, and a challenge to all Arabs." Now, Esmat Abdul-Magid is a very mild-mannered man. He's a very, he's an in-system player. He's been part of the Egyptian establishment that made peace with Israel when Anwar Sadat was alive a long time ago. Nevertheless, even he articulates grievances as to Jerusalem, and that part of the Israeli-Palestinian deal not only hasn't been negotiated, that crucial part hasn't been negotiated, but it really has nowhere to be negotiated, because the reality is, for anyone who knows Jerusalem, has been there, as I have often, the Israelis have pretty much put the Palestinians in ghettos. They've pretty much taken the land. They've pretty much pushed the Palestinians out. There really isn't much of a Jerusalem left to share. Now, they will fudge it in some way. They will find some terminology, some words, but in the end, it's not an agreement that's going to be perceived as just. It's not an agreement that's going to be perceived as widely supported. It's going to be perceived as imposed, just as throughout the region there are imposed client regimes in most of the countries in the Middle East. They don't get their legitimacy from the people. They certainly don't have any forms of democracy. What they get is their legitimacy from the Americans and the Europeans and the Israelis who work with them to keep them in power. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Brzezinski. I'm your host. I wish we had more positive things to say about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, but I thought it was important that we share with you the realities as we know them. I've myself visited 150 times to the region and know the situation quite well, but we also wanted to share with you all of these quotes from experts here at home and all over the world. Thank you for watching. Please tune in next week to another episode of Mideast Realities.